previous videos, we talked about developing rubrics. Rubrics is a systematic guideline used to assess the performance of the students undertaking certain process or tasks which is subjective in nature, in order to ensure the consistency in terms of the rating outcomes. The rubrics need to be designed in the objective manners. There are so many considerations while developing rubrics, in terms of appropriate terminologies to be used, numbers of criteria, types of the rubrics to be used, numbers of levels of performance, and so on and so forth. You will need to be careful with the common mistakes while developing the rubrics. Identify the criteria which are significant. You will use the rubrics as a measure to facilitate the learning of the students. Always go for something that is essential and fit the purpose of that particular assessment. Be careful with the statements for the performance criteria. It needs to be clearly stated, explicit, so that it is easy to differentiate different levels of performance. Always go for something which is observable in order to indicate different levels of performance. As for the descriptions, it should thoroughly reflect the characteristic of the criteria, which shouldn't be too simple and one-dimensional. You will have to ask yourself what are the components constituting the relevant criteria that you would like to assess, and then work out the relevant definitions for different levels until you convert everything into the statements. We have discussed about this as an example in our previous videos. There is one more thing that we have mentioned previously, is that developing the rubrics is not one-time job. Normally, when you construct the statements for the rubrics, the first time you construct it, it will be based on assumptions, which might not fully reflect the actual situations. It is especially when you do not have an idea the current levels of the students. Going back to the principles of educations would like to encourage learning. If certain characteristics has already been available among the students, there is no point we put them in the rubrics, as it's likely to end up to be redundant. We would like the improvement from the students. Therefore, normally after you have developed the rubrics, you're going to use the rubrics and then you're going to review them based on the performance of the students, which normally lecturers do not do that. A typical lecturer will stop after they have developed the rubrics and then start using the rubrics accordingly. Not knowingly, they miss one more step there, is to fine-tune and to make the rubrics more effective. This will have to be tested with the students in order to have an idea how effective is the rubrics. You know that the assessments in terms of the students' performance, especially when come to something which is subjective in nature, it is more likely to relative comparison. There are good performers and poor performers. Having the list of the components identified, which the students' achievement at different components may vary. You will have to fine-tune your rubrics from time to time so that it is more effective and more accurate in identifying the good performer and the poor performers. This leads to our next topic here about the continuous improvements of the rubrics. You know that defining the rubrics is important. If the criteria is wrongly defined or the performance criteria is not properly constructed, this can lead to inaccurate assessment. The rubrics might not be able to function well to differentiate good performers and the poor performers. Therefore, there is a need for rubrics to be constantly reviewed. Now, most ideally, the assessment result shall be equivalent to overall quality perceived. This can only be checked when you have used the rubrics at least once with your students. Don't just stop there after you have constructed the rubrics. Look into the rubrics, see if it is good enough. Let us talk about certain common problems encountered with the rubrics. First, the assessment result is not equivalent to the quality. For example, this case, we have poor quality, moderate quality, and good quality. This is the actual situation. But what happened is, when you use the rubrics, the result end up to be poor quality end up to be average mark, moderate quality low mark, good quality high marks. There is no arguments between good qualities and high marks. However, now these rubrics have the difficulty to differentiate those with moderate and poor qualities. Now the rubrics, one of the requirements is the ability to differentiate good and poor quality. You need to ensure that. That's why you need to review this constantly. Second problem, it will be the low sensitivities. Let's say now having this similar scenario, poor, moderate and good quality. And then when you see the result here, out of total 10 marks here, poor quality get 8 marks, moderate get 8.2, good quality get 8.3. Yes, now the rubrics is able to identify poor, moderate and good quality, but now the numbers here seems to be quite close. There is no significant difference in terms of the result between the good and poor quality. And if you see the result here, it seems more towards higher end. 8 point something means what? It means the students are qualified to get A out of 100 marks, even though the quality is poor. That shouldn't be the way. A good rubrics should have adequate rating for goods and poor. If it is really poor, then it shouldn't be too high in terms of the marks. And if the differences between poor and good qualities is very significant, the relevant significance should also be indicated by the assessed result. Next problem, inappropriate emphasis. You know that there are several criteria in the typical analytic rubrics. Different criteria look into the qualities of the student's work from different perspectives. And those perspectives may not be equal to each other. Some criteria may seem to be less important, some criteria may seem to be somewhat important, and some criteria could be the most important. Since we have different levels of importance of those criteria, based on the result, the relevant weightage should also be in line with it, which in this case, the criteria which is less important carry higher weightage. As for the criteria which is the most important carry the lowest weightage. Now the emphasis here is not in line with the importance. This shall ultimately lead to inaccurate assessment. Now a good characteristic of the rubrics is that the emphasis should be placed in the right place. Another problems is related to the challenges. This goes back to the purpose of the rubrics as a mechanism to facilitate the learning of the students. There are easy tasks, moderate tasks, and challenging tasks. You may also interpret this in terms of the amount of effort that students need to put into in order to present their works. Little effort, moderate effort, a lot of effort. Now when come to the weightage here, it should also be in line with the levels of challenges. the marks given to the students should be worthy of the efforts. What you see here, these are the possible aspects that a rubrics can go wrong. Even though you have constructed the rubrics, seems to be quite perfect. And this explains the reason why the assessment result can be very much different from the overall quality perceived. Because of this, you will have to test the rubrics, fine-tune the criteria and the definitions within the rubrics, test it again, constantly review, revise as necessary, and over time, it will end up to be a well-established rubrics, having the ability to differentiate good and poor quality, having adequate ratings of good and poor qualities, having the right emphasis, and the marks given should be worthy of the effort. You need to bear in mind that the selections of the right rubrics is important. Different rubrics leads to different assessment outcome, and you will have to design the rubrics really meeting the purpose of the assessment. Your selection of the rubrics should be in line with the purpose and also the emphasis of the assessment. Knowing all this, maybe let us talk about a bit in terms of the limitations of the rubrics, which many lecturers may not know. First, when you develop the rubrics, if possible, we would like to have really thorough assessment. But you know that for any learning task, when we want to define the quality of the students, this can be defined by various aspects. When it involves a lot of aspects there, that means there is certain degree of complexity. Now, when the case is too complicated, beyond the manageable level, the assessment will not be accurate. Therefore, one of the limitations of the rubrics is that normally we will not have really thorough assessment of all the aspects. Knowing these limitations, we will have to choose only the essential aspects. What are the things that you feel is more important to the students? What are the things that going to best help the students to equip themselves with necessary knowledge as well as skills for them to meet the challenges in the working industry in future? We use the rubrics as a mechanism to facilitate learning. Therefore, we should always go for the essential aspects. And you also know that there are recommended range in terms of the assessment criteria. The maximum it would be 6 assessment criteria from the practical considerations. Now you really need to properly select which one is more important and incorporate them in the rubrics. Make sure there is no redundancy so that you will not assess certain things twice. Second limitations of the rubrics is that what is not stated in the rubrics shall not be considered. We will have to keep ourselves professional, objective, and non-biased. Based on the words of the students, normally we have a perceived overall quality. But our mindset when we are doing the rating shouldn't be emotional and shouldn't be biased and manipulated by the perceived qualities. Theoretically, it should be solely based on the performance criteria as stipulated in the rubrics. If you find your rubrics having some limitations, it is either for you to modify your rubrics or to mark the performance of the students accordingly and go for review and revisions in the next semester. No matter what, you should strongly abide to the guidelines of the rubrics. That should be the right way to use the rubric. Why is it so? If you can once a while not guided by the rubrics, that means the rubrics cannot serve its function. Ultimately, you cannot fully eliminate the inconsistency in terms of the assessment, which also defeat the purpose of fairness in terms of the assessment to the students. Next, you will have to make the rubrics to be transparent to the students. Because of this, it's going to become advantageous to the students who are trained to score by the marking scheme. Not every student knows how to deal with the rubrics. Nonetheless, there are still some have been well trained how to score the rubrics. With that, they will just need to make sure themselves fulfill all the requirements in the rubrics, while careless on the other aspect not covered by the rubrics. This can be the limitations of the rubrics, especially for the students who do not know how to deal with the rubrics. Nevertheless, this can be overcome. We can always educate all the students how to deal with the rubrics. Don't consider this as a part of leaking the requirements towards the students. You don't have to keep this as a secret to the students, because your ultimate goal here is to facilitate learning. That's why your rubrics should be designed in the mode of slightly challenging than what the students are capable of. Ultimately, you are actually encouraging the learning and practices. Knowing those limitations, you can actually make good use of them. Another limitations with the rubrics, it will be the score-effort relation phenomena. For those who have been quite experienced in academic field, I believe you have observed this. Ideally, we would like the score and the effort of the quality to be in line. They are supposedly be linearly proportional. This is the ideal situations. But what happened in the reality? The curve will look something like this. It is not perfectly linear, and the increment of the score by the amount of effort or quality demonstrated by the students is not constant throughout. It is easier to score at the lower levels of effort and quality. Reaching towards the higher level, now the score increment become limited. There should be a significant increment in terms of the effort or the quality that can bring to small increments to the score, which is not really fair to the students. Ultimately, this is going to bring to a situation that most students will target their performance somewhere here. Because by putting into this much effort versus putting into this much effort, only a little differences. Why would students double their effort just for that a few marks increment? In this case, the rubrics have some limitations, especially in terms of facilitating the learning of the students. That's why we will need to continuously improve the rubrics, regularly review and revise the rubrics as necessary. Knowing the actual scenario is something like this, your ultimate goal is something like this, and you know that in the reality, it is nearly impossible to convert it to become a linear proportion relationship. But at least what you can do, you can adjust this so that it is more closely resemble the ideal case. We can allow certain degree of differences. At least it is better than this. This is the importance of the continuous quality improvement, CQI. Again, come back to our point. Developing rubrics, it will not be only one-time job. If you found your rubrics has been used continuously over the time without any further improvement since the first version, most likely you overlook this. Now your ultimate goal here is to have the actual rated outcome to be as close as possible to the ideal case. Now that we have covered breadth and depth related to the rubrics, Knowing so many considerations in developing rubrics, the significance of review and improving the rubrics, and also know the limitations of the rubrics. You should use this, fine-tune them for a better assessment in order to make meaningful the assessment result for the evaluations of the course programs as a part of the outcome-based education. All these are interrelated.